this computer? Hi, everybody. I'm Maxine McBrinn. I used to be the Curator of Archaeology at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture. I'm now a Research Associate at the Office of Archaeological Studies. And thank you for joining us for this talk. Before I start the talk itself, I should probably remind you that archaeology is a way of looking at human culture through the material remains. So the stuff that people leave behind, the things that they've made, the things they use, the food they eat, the buildings that they build and live in, the fields that they create to farm in, all of that. And the topic today is looking at ancestral Pueblo children and how we can see them in the past. And it's not really simple. You know, when we walk into a house today and we see that there are children living there, we'll see toys on the floor, we'll see special kinds of furniture that children use, things like changing tables, cribs, high chairs. We don't really see those in the past. So how do we see children? Well, one way we could do that, and we will not be discussing that today, is to look at burials. We're not going to talk about that at all. Instead, let's start by looking at a special kind of furniture that were for children. And those are cradle boards. So what you see on the screen now are some historic cradle boards. The wicker cradle boards on your left are from Hopi, and the plank wooden cradle board on your right is from Zuni. And a few things to note: these were not ever meant to be worn, used vertically, so not on mom's back or on dad's back, for that matter. These are meant to be used flat. And you can see that because there's no footrest to keep the baby from falling off. The other thing that these have is they all have hoods. So they have a way to keep the flies and the dust and the sun off of the baby's face. And that's, it turns out, something that gets added as we go along in the cradle boards. The way that these were used historically is that babies were placed in the cradle board, and some of these boards were made specifically for that baby and used only by that baby on the day that they were born. So the day they're born, they're put in a cradle board and they're kept in the cradle board pretty much full time for the first few months of their life, maybe 3 months. And then they're used intermittently until the babies are maybe 6 months or a year old. And the babies are kept in them except for feeding and changing. So this is the place where the baby lives and where the baby sees the world around him or her. The cradles can be rested on mom's lap. They can be put on the floor near her if she's doing some work. They can be put in a safe place in a room with the family while everybody's all gathered together. The baby is sort of lashed in, and you can see on this Zuni cradle board on the right that there's some loops, and those loops are used for securing the baby into place. And they will be put on a pad of something like juniper, shredded juniper bark, and then many, many blankets wrapped around the baby. So they're really nice and secure, and they're swaddled in these. So now let's go back in time, and we're going way back in time. So let's go back about 2,000 years to the Basket Maker II period. And you're going to see something that looks actually similar. So this is a Basket Maker 2 cradle board that came from southeastern Utah. And you are seeing the front and then the back. So the front is on the left and the back is on the right in this slide. Note that this cradle board has a footrest. And so this is a cradle board that was meant to be worn with the baby in it by mom as she's walking around doing the things that she needs to do. But it otherwise looks very much like that Zuni cradle board. There is no hood on it. What you're seeing on the left-hand side is a handle, and it's probably not placed at this point the way it would have been used when the baby was actually in the cradle board. You can see some remnants of lining cloth that would have helped protect the baby. And then they would have had a lot of, again, swaddling around them. This was also interesting because there's 2 layers of frames here. There's the frame that you see on the left-hand side. That's the one that actually is making the cradle board. That's what's holding the cradle board together. But the one on the right is inside that one, and it probably allows the baby to be placed on the ground and actually still kept up out of the dust. And here's a historic Apache woman, probably a Western Apache woman, wearing a similar kind of a cradle board. And you can see that the baby is really swaddled in there. And you can see that the ropes that are lashing the baby into place. But one thing to note about this is that the baby's head can move around. The baby can see the world as it goes by very easily. And in this case, the baby does have a hood to protect it from the elements, the sun, the rain, maybe even some flies, but it's not obscuring the baby's view. And you can see that this child has an older sibling who is out walking around with mom. And this is actually very common for women who were hunters and gatherers, very mobile bands, that you would carry the child like this. And it's safe for the child. It's convenient for the mother, not too much of a burden for the mother. And these cradle boards are made to allow that the mom can carry the baby around. Okay. And here is some of the kind of bedding that you would have. So you would have multiple layers. What you're seeing on the right-hand side is 2 rabbit fur blankets. The one on top is a little coarser. It uses the rabbit hide, all of the rabbit hide. But the one that's labeled F, so the one in the middle on the right, is actually made only from the softest hair, which is from the white belly of bunnies. And this would have been what was right next to the baby and would have allowed the baby to just have a lovely, warm, soft, very soft covering on it. They have this funny shape because they actually stop, the baby is swaddled to its little tuchus, its little rear end, and then those long legs actually wrap around the baby's legs to keep the baby warm. And this is a way of ensuring that these blankets don't get, pooped on. Okay. Now, when we come later in time, this is a Pueblo 3, what's called a rigid cradle board. And although this one does have a footrest, it actually is meant to be used horizontally so that the baby is next to mom, just like what we're seeing in the historic period. That funny little bundle that is labeled B is a little pillow made out of juniper bark. And there's a board inside there, and it protects the baby's head from lying against that board. Note the hood. This hood is actually a very restrictive view hood for the baby. You can also see the lashing points so that the baby is still swaddled in there. And this would have been pretty easy to pick up and carry around. And historically, they even sometimes hung the cradles from the vigas in the roof. And so, you know, almost like a little cradle that you could then swing and soothe the baby that was fretting a little bit. Now, how would the baby look in this cradle board? Well, probably something like this. And this was, this is adapted from an early archaeologist, Samuel Guernsey, who is showing how this would be used. And note that there's something that the baby is lying up against that's kind of putting the head up. And this allows the neck to develop a longer line. And so it was at least in the historic periods, it was a very deliberate choice to have the pillow inclined in this way. Now, between Basket Maker 2 and Pueblo 3, 1,000 years have gone by, and people's lives are very different. Basket Maker 2 people are largely still hunters and gatherers. They're doing a little bit of farming. They're staying in one place for weeks, a few months at a time. But by the time we get to the Pueblo 3 period, they're building pueblos that look very familiar to us. This time also encompasses Mesa Verde, a bunch of sites that you have probably seen, are familiar with. And these are communities that have aggregated in one place, and they are staying there for decades at a time. And so people are growing up within a single community. The other thing that has really changed is that rather than being out looking for plants to harvest or doing some small scale hunting, mom is now staying at home. She's making pottery. She's cooking at the fire. There are fields nearby that people are working. And so the baby doesn't need to be carried around on mom's back anymore. And instead, there's a larger community that can look after the child if mom has something else she needs to be doing. So the cradle boards are actually telling us a lot about the community that these children are part of and will grow up to become contributing members to. Now, way back in the early days of archaeology in the Southwest, there was a lot of discussion about cranial deformation. And we will get to that in just a second. I want to show you one more cradle board. This is also Pueblo 3 period. This one is made from the bark. They've just cut a square of bark out of a cottonwood tree. And the child is going to be lying against that. The handle that you see may well be part of a hood that's going to come and, again, protect the child from flies, from dust, from all of that stuff. You can see the leather lashings that they have used to create the sides of the cradle on either side of this big piece of cottonwood. And you can see some of the padded leather still on the bottom of it. So the child's going to lie on top of this cottonwood bark. The sides will come up to protect them, and the child will be swaddled in it and lashed into place, and then will live in this cradle board for a few months during the first year of its life. But let's go back now to that cranial deformation that I was talking about. You know that when babies are born, their skulls are still soft, as we say. It's one of the reasons that you want to be very careful with children's heads. And a number of cultures around the world, and one I immediately think of are the classic Maya, actually took advantage of this. The Egyptians did as well, there are others, by wrapping a child's head so that its skull, when it's still soft, can be formed into a shape that's found attractive by the society. There are other times when children's crania, their skulls, are changed by habitual lying in one position. And that's what we think we're seeing in the Southwest. So early archaeologists discovered that there were different ways that skulls of people looked, and different crania. So A is, the way presumably ours look, unless anyone out there has had cranial deformation done. B, occipitally deformed, is what happens if a child is lying flat, absolutely flat on the back of its head. And then that lamboidally deformed is that funny little angled cushion that we saw in one of the previous cradle boards. And early archaeologists saw this happening, this cranial deformation starting to happen at the same time that farming became a big thing in the Southwest. And they thought that this was a migration, that the original people who did not have any deformation of the crania had been pushed out by people who had deformation practices of some kind. And now we know that that's not true. What happened is that how babies were carried and cradled in their first year or two of life changed over that period, as cradle boards changed over that period. And so what they were actually seeing is the use of a different kind of cradle board. And it's the same people, they just changed their practices a little bit. Now, all of this that I've been telling you about cradle boards comes from a really wonderful article by Claudette Piper, and it was her master's thesis work at the University of Northern Arizona. She published this paper in 2002. It's called Morphology of Pre-Hispanic Cradle Boards, Form Follows Function. And I want to give her full credit for it because it's a really cool article. So now let's look at something that's a little harder to see in the archaeological record. What we're trying to get to, of course, is culture and human behavior, but not everything we do shows up in the archaeological record. And so there are other ways that we try to get to some of this information. And so, for example, the role that children play in their societies and in their communities is a question where they, like in some societies, children have no responsibilities until they are quite physically mature. And in other societies, very young children begin to contribute economically. So what's going on here in the ancestral Puebloan Southwest? Well, one thing that we can do is to look at what was happening in the Pueblos in the historic period. And so Kathy Camp, in a wonderful article, again, 2002, called Working for a Living, Childhood in the Prehistoric Southwestern Pueblos, looked at what was the role of children in the historic Pueblos. And you can see that children did all kinds of things. They took messages, they ran errands, they got water, they swept, they took care of their younger siblings, they helped in the fields, they helped learned, and then helped make things like pots and baskets, houses. They helped make houses, hunted, gathered, learned all of the skills that they needed to become fully functioning adults. Now, I want to read very quickly a quote from Tessie Naranjo, who is an elder at Santa Clara, and she's talking about her childhood. She says, one of the things that children incorporated very early into their consciousness was that work was necessary to feel good about oneself and to have others think well of you. If it was said that you were a hard worker, you felt you were paid one of the highest compliments. As children, we carried our younger brothers and sisters on our backs while we swept the plaza area, helped get clay or mixed the clay with temper to make pottery. We also mixed the mud with our feet for making adobe and mortar. After the mud was mixed, we also helped carry the bricks and mortar to build the walls. Cooking was done by girls at a fairly early age. Boys were off in the fields helping with hoeing and harvesting, and in the mountains hunting and fishing. So from a pretty early age, children are contributing to the community, at least in the historic Pueblos. And we have no reason to think that this would not have been the case earlier. So I pulled some historic photos to show you children at work. And here we have children getting water at Cochiti. You can see they're carrying the buckets of water from the water tank. This little girl at San Ildefonso Pueblo is perhaps copying the older girls and women who would carry Oyas water jars on their head. And at some of the Pueblos, I know they had smaller containers for younger children to be able to go and collect water and bring it back. Smaller buckets in the historic period. Here's a couple of little girls who are carrying their siblings on their back. And one of the things that really strikes me is, especially the little girl on the left, the child that she's carrying is not, it's a pretty big child for the size that she appears to be. So I think this happened, relatively quickly. Here's an elder who is husking corn, and he's got a lot of kids around him who look like they are having a great time, but you see that several of them are actually holding corn, so they're husking as well, even if they don't seem to be doing it quite as seriously as this elder is. And here you, in the back of this group of young people, you see the boys with their bows and arrows in the back of the group. And of course, that would have been a way of providing meat for the group. And I don't know if any of the younger women in front are tending that cook fire, but they could be. And then finally, one of the roles that people do at Pueblos is take part in ceremonies. And for those of you who have been to corn dance, any of the other ceremonies, you'll often see really young children taking part and providing their bodies and their spirits to this ritual. Now, there are some things that children can do without a lot of training, like running errands, but there are other things that you learn that you need to learn over time, you need to be trained in. So being able to make a wonderful piece of pottery, a basket, weaving, creating tools, all of those are things that would have required specialized training. So children probably start about 6 doing the less skilled kinds of tasks and probably begin to learn to become crafts people and specialized creators by about age 8. That's also at Hopi, the time when girls started learning to grind maize. And that doesn't seem like such a skilled task, but it requires physical strength to use the mano, to hold the mano and actually be able to grind for any, length of time. And so girls worked up to that. And of course, being able to show that you can grind maize for long periods of time was part of the coming of age ceremonies for young women. So archaeologically, we might be able to see, and we think we can see, some of this craft training. But first I'm going to show you historically. Here's 3 girls from Okeowenge. I don't think they are making these pots. It doesn't look like they are, although the one in the middle might be. But they're sitting with the pots, and they're probably, the one in the middle is certainly of an age where she might have been learning to become a potter. So archaeologically, this is a pot that my colleague Julia Clifton found. This is a Mimbres bowl, a Mimbres classic bowl. So from about 80,000 to 1100. And does this show a woman instructing a child on how to do something like weaving, creating a fish trap? I don't know, but it's a provocative image, and it makes you wonder, what's going on there, and is that what we're seeing here? This image is from a paper by Elizabeth Bagwell, and she was looking at miniatures from Pecos Pueblo. Miniatures are what we think children would probably start making as potters, and these in general are pinch pots, so they're not created by coiling. You just take a piece of clay and you manipulate it with your fingers to make little bowls or little tiny jars. But we do know that not all miniatures were made by children, or even for children to use as toys. Miniatures are also created as parts of various ceremonies. And some of them are not particularly skilled looking. Bagwell did a study in which she looked at skill and size in making various kinds of pottery from Pecos, and believed that she could see that some of these miniatures were made by children who were learning to become potters. What I had hoped to be able to show you here is some miniatures that are in the collection at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture and will be part of the new Here, Now, and Always exhibit. These were very carefully chosen by my co-curator, Joseph Aguilar of San Ildefonso, and by myself. And one of the really wonderful things about it, as we looked at them in detail, was that on some of them, we could see tiny little fingerprints and tiny little finger impressions showing that these were pots that had not been created by adults. They had been made by children, because we could see these impossibly small finger impressions in them. But you can see that when Here, Now, and Always opens in June, and they will be in their own little case in the ancestors portion. And then finally, here are some pots that were made cooperatively between adults and children. And this is from a paper by Patricia Crown, which is called Learning and Teaching in the Pre-Hispanic American Southwest. So if you look at pot A here, and I'm sorry, this is not a great photo, it is a scan from a book, but pot A is a hohokam vessel that was jarred, that was made by a child. And she says that based on its asymmetry and its lumpiness. And those are the terms that she used. And you can see that the painting is not entirely laid out across the whole surface. Some lines are closer to each other than others. So this is actually a jar that she thinks was made entirely by a child, an early learner as a potter. Pot B is a miniature Tularosa black on white. And so that is from the west central part of New Mexico, probably maybe a little over into the Arizona side of that. This was made by a child, again, based on its asymmetry. It's not very well finished, but it was painted by an adult. And you can see that the painting here is actually quite complex and is laid out across the surface in a very pleasing way. C is a miniature Cibola whiteware jar, and that was made by an adult, but painted by a child. And you can see that the child kind of lost track of where he, or more likely she, was across the surface. And the lines are not entirely finished. They're just, it looks like somebody who is just learning the craft made that. If you look at D, this is a Hopi black on yellow bowl, and the bowl was made by a child, again, based on asymmetry, lumpiness. But you can see that the outside was decorated by an adult who did actually a really nice job. And then the inside, well, that was probably decorated by the child. And you can see that it's not really a design in the way that you would normally see in this kind of a bowl. It's, it's a child who's playing and learning. And you see that again in E. So in this case, this is a St. John's polychrome, which often has white paint on the outside of it. The inside is really nicely decorated. The outside, I think, somebody said to a child, here, you can decorate the outside. And as Dr. Crown says, this looks like it was finger painted on the outside. It's really charming when you think of it that way. And F, you see a more accomplished child potter. This is an adult-made bowl. It's another Tularosa black on white. The adult has sketched in and done actually a fair amount of the design itself, but some of that fine line, what we call hatchering, diagonal fine lines on it, were not very well done. They're not very parallel and not always very diagonal either. And so the shape has been outlined by probably the adult, but a child did the more time-intensive fine line painting, or at least some of it, on the inside of this. Well, so, scholars have been interested in the role of children, the health of children. There are a number of studies about that, which I'm not going to talk about today because this is just a short talk. What we do know is that there were children in the past, of course. That's how societies replicate themselves. All people have children. And we know that these children learned to become full responsible members of their communities. And it's actually really charming that we can see glimpses of how this happened in pottery. We can also see it in basket making, in weaving, but that's the topic for another day. Thank you so much for joining us, and happy Archaeology Day.